So, again, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming. We are joined today by the wonderful Julie Carrick Dalton, who is going to speak with us about climate fiction and about her incredible novels that she's come out with over the last few years. She has several books that are currently in progress that will be coming out anticipated in May of 2025 and 2027. So look out for The Forest Becomes Her in 2025. Very exciting. I'm going to post a brief bio in the chat just for everybody here so that you can get a little bit more familiar while she's speaking. And Julie, I would love it if you could tell us how you got interested in climate fiction and what your first foray into climate fiction was.
Well, it was actually just an accident. I didn't know that there was a such thing as climate fiction. I didn't know it was a category or a genre or anything. I started writing a novel, and it was set in the mountain. This is my first novel, Waiting for the Night Song, and it was set in the mountains of New Hampshire. It was a very nature-infused story. It had two timelines, one in a childhood timeline, and then the same individual when they were in their 30s who had returned home to their hometown. And things were different, that the climate had changed. And that's because it was set in New Hampshire, where I was running a farm at the time. And I was experiencing some issues related to climate change on my farm. In my agricultural region, our temperature had gone up a lot. So much so that over the past 100 years, our growing season had extended by 22 days, that's like 3 weeks longer of a growing season, which really affects what thrives and what doesn't. And so I was working on my farm all day and then writing this book at night. And so all these elements of invasive species, plants that weren't thriving the way they did generations ago. All this was in my mind as I was doing agricultural research, as I was working on my farm and writing this story. And it just the story became infused with elements of climate crisis because that's what I was thinking about all day. So I wrote the book. I did a workshop at GrubStreet in Boston, which is a writing center. And somewhere along the line, someone's like, "Oh, that's great. You're writing climate fiction." And I'm like, "What? What is climate fiction?" And I became aware that there were, a lot of other people out there that were feeling the same thing I was feeling, that it's a present fear. People are thinking about it. They're worried about it. They're looking at the future for their children. Or, I was thinking about my farm. Um, I became aware that New Hampshire's iconic sugar maple trees could be threatened within my lifetime. Excuse me, I have a little bit of a cough. Um, and so all these things that I was thinking about, the things that keep me awake at night, were keeping other people awake at night. And they were also writing stories that were bringing these elements of climate crisis in. And so I wouldn't say that climate fiction is a genre. It's more of a subcategory under a lot of different genres. You'll find thrillers, horror novels, mystery, suspense, rom-coms, a lot of YA fiction that are incorporating elements of climate science into the stories. And I think it's because we're all thinking about it. We all see the news, we all are experiencing, either wildfires or droughts, or if we aren't personally experiencing them, people we know are, or we're watching it on the news. So I think it's creeping into all genres. And so I don't think there are probably very many bookstores that have like a climate fiction section, but in just about every section, you can probably find a climate fiction novel, if that makes sense. And something else, another trend that I've been watching is that there tend to be this is all anecdotal. I do not have scientific evidence to prove this, but from what I see, there are more marginalized writers writing in the climate fiction space than I think in fiction more broadly, because I think a lot of the stories that are, being told are being told by people who are experiencing them. And a lot of times that tends to be marginalized communities that don't have access to resources to evacuate or to rebuild. Communities that have been historically relegated to land that's less protected. They tend to be indigenous communities, Black and brown communities, and not just in the United States, but around the world. So some of the most compelling climate fiction stories that are being published now are coming from marginalized writers, which I think is amazing because we're hearing stories from like on the ground. And I think that's an important part of this category of fiction, that it's telling some really authentic stories.
I love that. Thank you so much. And that's such an important point that the people who are most affected by the climate crisis are the ones who are going to be writing about it.
Yeah.
So that's a fantastic point. Um, I'd love to ask about your farm and how kind of living with the land has like shaped your idea of the environment and sustainability. When did you start owning a farm? I mean, how did that
Yeah, that's a story in itself. So our families had a like a family home in New Hampshire for a long time, and there was this big stretch of land. It was a 102-acre forest that butted up against where our home was, and it's very rural. We had a lot of moose. We would have black bear walk into our yard, and moose would walk into our yard. Lots of critters, and this piece of land went on the market for timber and development, and they started clear cutting the land. And it was in during the recession, a lot of people were selling off land in New Hampshire, and all I kept thinking about was like these bear and these moose that, like, I love seeing them, show up in my yard, were being displaced, and this forest was being clear cut. So um, I pulled resources with a friend who needed a barn, a place to winter her horses, and the land that had already been, we bought the land. And so we had this piece of land and we needed a business because you can't just like sit there with a piece of land. We needed to make money off of it in some way. So there had been 6 acres already cleared by the time we got to it. We built a barn and she ran a horse business and I started growing vegetables. So I maintained all the land in terms of the fields, we had 2 miles of trails in the woods for the horses, the pastures, all of the dirt, anything involving dirt was mine, and everything involving the horses was hers. And we used to joke that the only way our business models crossed paths was at the manure pile where she would deposit and I would withdraw. So it was a perfect little setup. Um, and so we preserved the land, the most of the forest, other than the 6 acres that had been cleared, were protected, and we opened the trails up to the public so that they're operated by New Hampshire as actually it's run as if it's a state park. Um, we don't keep it open to where the barn is, where the horses are and the vegetables and everything, but all through the woods, all the trails are open to the public, and the state has partnered with us. Now the bittersweet part of the story is that I sold the farm to my business partner. I ran it for about 15 years, and when I got a contract for 2 books, and then right after, well, shortly after that, I got a contract for a third and fourth book, and I kind of came to a point where I was like, I've got 4 kids, a farm, these books, and my mental health, and one of those 4 things is not going to make it. So I felt really comfortable that we had protected the land. My business partner loved it as much as I did. I sold it to her and she is running a thriving business and the land is in great shape, and I'm happy to say there are still bear and moose there. So I'm no longer farming, but I'm really proud of that piece of land. And the third book, the one I'm working on right now, which is actually due on February 15th, is about deforestation, and it's about a tract of land that was clear cut, and it's about the impact deforestation can have on a community beyond just the visual absence of trees, like what the impact has on a community more broadly. And it was really inspired by the 15 years I spent managing a 100-acre forest, and working with the land. So that farm really shaped me as a writer, made me really in tune with, I mean, I was literally would be writing with dirt under my fingernails, for years. I would come home from working in the field all day, dirty and tired and sweaty, and then taking a lot of the things that I'd been thinking about on the farm and putting them into my books. So it's still with me. That dirt, you can't see it, but it's still under my fingernails.
I love that it's still with you. Um, I how did you learn how to keep a farm? I mean, that's a huge, impossible sounding task. And when you talk about it, it just blows my mind that you did that for 15 years.
Yeah.
I mean, how did you get into that? Did you grow up on a farm when you were a kid, or did you
I
learn?
had no business running a farm. I didn't know what I was doing. It was a knee jerk, like this land is being clear cut. And if I buy it, I have to do something with it. And if I'm going to do something with it, this is the only thing I can do with it. So it wasn't very logical. I went back to Tufts University has a new program called the New Entry Sustainable Agriculture Program. It's like a certificate program. It's not a degree, but they teach classes on sustainable agriculture. I did that program. I joined the New Hampshire Farmers Bureau. I made a lot of mistakes. I was very intent on keeping it 100% organic, which is a lot because there's a lot of all the animals that I wanted to protect wanted to eat my farm. So I had now had all these, deer that was like, oh, this is great. You opened a salad buffet for me. Thank you. So I had to learn to manage the environment and the animals that there were days that those deer that I was so bent on protecting, I wanted to strangle because they were like getting into the fields. So I had to learn to manage with organic practices. I put up deer fence. I actually put up an electric fence because of bears. It's just like a thin wire, and it doesn't like injure them, but it's enough to like deter them from going into the fields. It wasn't always successful. I did a lot of I invested heavily in plastic snakes, and I would scatter plastic snakes all over the place because it would keep birds from landing on the ground crops and things that were on the ground. I put up a lot of silver tape, like you can imagine like streamer tape, but it's shiny silver on stakes, so that it would flap in the wind because it scares birds away. So I did a lot of trial and error, a lot heavily emphasizing the error part. So I learned, and I learned things I wasn't good at growing for some reason. And I did a lot of soil, amending soil. I had an awful time with peppers for some reason. My peppers just were awful, but I grew great corn. My potatoes were spectacular. Like I would go through years and try to learn what my land was willing to give me and do better the next season. Like I stopped growing peppers. I gave up peppers, and I love peppers, but they do not love me. So I just had to learn by trial and error.
Well, it sounds like you also did a lot of research, going back and forth. It sounds very similar actually to the writing process of
And a
just
lot
kind
of
of
it showed
figuring
up in the
out.
book. Waiting for the
Yeah.
Night Song is set in an agricultural community, and it's in a forest, and there's climate crisis. So a lot of the research I was doing and the classes I was taking for agriculture ended up being part of my novel.
Yeah, I love that. Um, so speaking of research, something that I did want to talk to you about is how much research goes into something like climate fiction, which is based on, facts, scientific evidence. How much of that do you research beforehand, and how much do you allow to be under the nebulous cloud of willing suspension of disbelief?
That's a really good question because I think that there's like a real tension in there. There's a in Waiting for the Night Song is a contemporary novel, and there aren't any fantastical elements. I didn't invent any science for it, but what I did do is take a real insect, the mountain pine bark beetle, that's been devastating forests in the western and central parts of the United States, and I brought it to New Hampshire for the book. It doesn't exist in New Hampshire yet. It likely will migrate there. At some point, it is moving east. Um, so I had to research conditions that would make that bark beetle come to New Hampshire, and that's drought, and that's rising temperatures, and that's a forest with pine in it. So I had to research what conditions that beetle could exist in New Hampshire, even though it doesn't actually exist here yet. So if I had created a situation that I had that beetle move in during a year of like a lot of rain, that would have made no sense. So I had to understand that beetle. I spent a lot of time eavesdropping on entomology Twitter, which at the time, I'm not a big Twitter fan now, but back then, I was following all these entomologists and following their conversations and reading the articles they were sharing specifically about bark beetles and how the impact they had on trees and what they looked like, the texture of it, and trying to incorporate these details into the story. And then my second book, The Last Beekeeper, I'm a beekeeper, and so I had the basic understanding of what a hive smells like, feels like, the textures, the sounds, the vibrations, the taste, all those things. I had that in me, but I'm not a scientist. I'm not a bee expert. So I reached out to a beekeeping professor again at Tufts University at their veterinary college, and we got on Zoom a couple times, and I would share parts of the book with her. She actually helped me come up with a plot point because it does have some speculative science in it. I create something. I don't want to like give the book away, but there's an element, a scientific element that I introduce towards the end of the book that's not real. But I had to understand what conditions could make this possible. It's something that is conceivable. It just hasn't happened. But I needed to understand um it was based on bees, but I was inspired by something that actually happened with mosquitoes. And I had been reading some articles about some mutations related to mosquitoes. So I went down that rabbit hole and I used the research that I had been following on mosquitoes and tried to understand how could that um, play out if it were bees, and what would the implications be, and how would that play out in the real world. And so this entomologist from Tufts helped me work through that and rein me in, be like, nope, that wouldn't happen. But she also pointed me in some directions I hadn't thought of. She actually added to the plot of my story. So bringing scientists into the process, I think, is and they like it too. Like, I found that the scientists that I've talked to are excited that someone wants to explore their area of interest so deeply.
That's really fascinating. I love that you kind of take your like, what if scenarios and then you have a formula to plug that into. Like if it
Yeah.
works for mosquitoes, will it work for bees?
Yeah.
Probably. We'll
Yeah.
just use that. It's amazing.
And
Um,
so I've done some talks with like I just did a lecture at the University of Delaware in the fall, and they have an agricultural college, and I did it in conjunction with their beekeeping expert, and we did the program together, talking about the elements of my story that are real and that aren't real, and the conditions that could make it real, but also just the idea that me telling the story can excite interest in entomology, in climate science, and people who might not show up for a documentary or read an article about beekeeping, but they would read an article about a young woman facing a crisis in her life. They'd read it for the story. And then it introduces them to something that they might not have thought about, which I think is an exciting element of climate fiction.
Absolutely. I think one of the most fun things is how um, pun intended, how it cross-pollinates with other sections of literature, how you can take,
Yeah.
those scientific elements, how you can take, um, you know, these these personal stories, literary fiction, how you can take the genre fiction of science fiction and, fantasy and whatever else, and you
Yeah.
can just plug it in and it functions. It's just such a cool subgenre.
Yeah, and
Um,
the book I'm working on right now, the one I'm almost finished with, I've like pushed it a little further. I feel like I push it a little edgier with each book. And the third book is called The Forest Becomes Her, has some magical realism elements in it that are linked to ecology. That I've kind of like I've made the ecology more than it might be in the real world. But again, there's science, and there's a lot of soil science and mushroom science, a lot of fungi going on in this book. Did a lot of mushroom research. Um, so it's fun because I get to take real information and expand it, which is fun.
I love that. One question that we've already had in the chat is, do you have a specific approach to the research that you do, and how do you keep the information organized? So beyond speaking with these experts, what do you do on your own time to kind of keep all of these ideas and scientific concepts straight? And how do you apply that then to your writing?
Well, I when I draft a novel, I always draft it in Scrivener. I don't know if you guys know that program. It's a software. I love Scrivener. So in the it's a, if for anybody who's not familiar with it, it's a writing software program, and you can set it up for a novel, and you can set up chapters. You can set up a corkboard and with little like notes on the corkboard, but it also has a section for research at the bottom of it. So you can set up folders. You can set, so I always, whenever I am doing research, I take that research and I import it into my Scrivener file. So I have my document that I'm drafting the novel is in this like it's called the notebook section of it where all the chapters are. And then at the bottom, I have folders of research. So it's very easily accessible. And I can even like, cut and paste an idea from my research. Like if there's an article I want to use something, I can put it in at the top of a chapter and be like, refer to this while you're writing this chapter. So I make great use of Scrivener, and they also have folders where you can do character development in specific folders, and just different ideas that you want to keep organized. But it's all one document, it's one file. Like you click it and you open up one file and it has all of that in there. And both of my published novels are dual timeline novels, so they go back and forth in time. And so Scrivener allows you to color code things. So like I would do my past timeline, all the chapters would be in one color, in the heading, and in the present day chapters would be in a different color. So I could visually look at the table of contents of my book and notice if I'm writing more chapters in one timeline than the other. The book I'm just finishing right now has one timeline, but three point of view characters. So it's going back and forth with three characters. So I have three colors going on in the table of contents. And it helps me organize, and you can move chapters in Scrivener. You can like, drag them around and rearrange how you're telling the story. So I feel like I don't know how novels were written before Scrivener was invented. Like, I don't get it, because that to me is like the only way I can do it. But that doesn't mean it has to work for everybody. I know so many people who have wildly different processes, but for me, it helped me keep track of just ideas, post-it notes, detailed research, and the actual manuscript all in one place.
Yes, any tools like that are welcome. If you use anything,
Yeah.
throw that our way, please.
Okay. I will if I think of any
Uh,
others.
so in terms of the organizational process, I know you mentioned you were a journalist for a long time. What skills from that profession do you think you use currently in your current fiction journey? Has there been anything that's been more difficult to transfer over? Are there other things that might be really easy to kind of graft onto your new trajectory? How do you feel about that?
I think it was great training to be because it's in journalism, it's all about brevity, conciseness, nothing extra. Just, hit your word count and then cut 10% out of it. It's like it's very sharp, so it focuses you. And I covered a lot of different beats as a journalist. I did cover environment for a little bit. I did real estate, education. I covered the police beat. I was an obituary writer for a while. So I've done a ton of research. And I know how to do research. I know how to, go do deep dives in archives and libraries and, city halls and, wherever I need to go. And I feel very comfortable walking up to someone and saying, "Hey, can I interview you about, beekeeping?" Or, I feel very comfortable asking questions. And I find most people like to talk about the thing they're passionate about, whatever, their given field. Um, it's like just like right now, you're interviewing me, and I'm excited to talk about this because it's what I love to do. Most people like talking about what they do, So I think it just was a good training for me because it gave me the confidence to be able to walk up to anybody or go into any town hall and ask to see public records or, whatever I need. I feel comfortable doing it. But I think the reason I started writing fiction, I think, is, I did a lot of feature writing as well, like long form journalism. And, you can get more into the, emotional part of a story, more like the arc of a story and the narrative part. And sometimes like you can only write what is true, and you can only write what you know and what information you have. And sometimes when you're putting together a story, like, there's pieces of the story and you know what they are, but if you don't have those pieces, you can't put them in the article. Like you might know that this guy's lying, but you can't put that in the article if you can't prove it. In fiction, I can do anything I want. I like basing it on reality and like bigger truths, like emotional truths or, universal truths. Um, but I have the freedom to find the evidence that I want. Like if I want to prove that a character is misunderstood and he's really a good guy, I can do that. I can manipulate the characters, I can manipulate the weather to help tell my story, or I can, manipulate what any of the characters are doing to serve a different character storyline. So I think the journalism taught me how to tell, like find the spine of a story, and fiction helped me learn how to put like meat on the bones, I guess.
Thank you. That's a great analogy, meat on the bones. Um, I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about journalism, just in general, and how that shifted into what you're currently doing. I know that you are also a graduate of the Extension School of
Yes.
our Creative Writing and Literature program. So I would love to hear a little bit about that and just your career trajectory, because I think all of these things that you've done and all of these lives that you've lived have shown up in your writing and make you the writer that you are today. So I'd love to hear you
Yeah.
talk about.
So when I was working as a journalist, so I have 4 kids, and when I started the program at Harvard Extension School, I had 2 kids. When I graduated, I had 4 kids, um, and it was all in. It was not a low residency program then; it was in person, 100%. And so I had to show up to all these classes in person, and there were days when I quite literally, for whatever reason, had to bring a kid with me. And I was that person in class at a couple, it only happened like maybe 2 times, but I would have to have, those baby carriers that, I'd have like a newborn, and, I had been a journalist. When my 3rd child was born, I stopped working in-house at newspapers and magazines and went freelance at home, and I had a part-time nanny, so I was at home, but I was still a journalist, but freelance. And then, after my 4th child was born, 2 days after I turned in my thesis at Harvard. So I gave birth twice in 1 week, I like to think. And that was a point in my life where, I took some time off because 'cause I'd had this 4th child, and I didn't really go back to journalism. I still write articles sometimes, but almost exclusively, I write about writing. I write for, different publications. I do some book reviews sometimes. I will write about, things we're talking about here. I've written a lot about climate fiction. So I tend to write about writing now. And I kind of, that shift sort of happened gradually while I was taking classes at the extension school, still writing freelance from home. And then it kind of, once I graduated and I had the 4th kid, I was like, it's time, I'm gonna make a shift. And I continued taking other classes as well at GrubStreet in Boston, kind of built a writing community. And there was never a moment where I was like, I'm done with journalism. I'm now a fiction writer. It was just this, like they kind of like went like this, like I was both for a while. And then the emphasis just switched more to fiction, after my 4th child was born, and I got really involved with the writing community at Grub Street in Boston, and I'm still very involved there. I've like made wonderful friends and connections, and I teach there sometimes. If any of you are in Boston and are going to the Muse in the Marketplace conference in May, it's a great conference. I'm going to be teaching a couple classes there. So it was not a hard shift. It was like kind of a slow merge, from journalism to fiction.
And I know you mentioned that you write a lot about writing, and I've read some of your articles, and I really do enjoy just how you talk about the writing process. And you had one article that you published in Writer Unboxed,
Mhm.
and you said, "Fiction has power. How we choose to wield that power matters." Um, can you talk a little bit more about that? Because that quote has stayed with me the whole time I've been doing research for this event.
Oh, good. Well, I'm glad that stuck with you. I think that we make choices about what we want to write about. One thing I'll say before I start talking about this topic is I do not believe that artists owe anything to anybody. I don't like owe anybody a message. Like I don't owe some big takeaway to the reader. I owe them a story. I owe them a satisfying plot and characters that are moving through life, and that there's hopefully a satisfying resolution. The story is first. But I think most writers care about something. I care about other things besides climate, but the climate are the things that I mean, that's what I want to write about. And so when I'm writing a story, I'm telling you my truth. I'm telling you the things I believe in. And it does matter because I may have shared this story when I spoke to your group last year, so I apologize for repeating this, but I had a reviewer of my first book, wrote a review. It was not a big industry review, it was on a blog somewhere. And they started out the review saying, I don't really pay much attention to climate science, and I really don't like politics in my fiction. And I'm like, well, this is going to be an awesome review because my book is about climate change and there's politics in it. But the person went on, the next sentence was, but I really love the characters and I love the story. So by the time I got to the end of the book, I cared about the characters. And that meant I cared about what they cared about. And now I think differently about climate change. So I think we do have the ability I don't want to say I have the ability to change someone's mind or heart, but I do have the ability to make them think about something in a different way. Um, and I think that that's something that, I take seriously. I want to make sure that I'm getting the science right. Like if I'm introducing ideas to someone, I want to back them up. I don't want to just, say, and then climate change was solved. Like I'm not going to write that because I don't see that happening anytime in the near future. So I do owe a responsibility, I guess, to be honest to my own truth. And I hope other people can, it'll maybe open up conversations, like maybe that person who wrote that blog talked to one of their friends about it and who, hadn't thought about it that way. And, maybe it had ripple effects that I don't know about. And I think that all fiction has the ability to do that, not just like issue related fiction, but, a romance novel, the way characters treat each other, the way we interact with people who are different than us. I think there is power in the words we put in a book, because when I finish writing that book and I close that final copy, I give it to you. And now it's your book. And you take out of it whatever's in there. I can't defend myself. I can't be like, no, 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 that's not what I meant. What I put in that book is in your hands. And what you take away from it, I can't control. So I have to like really own what I put into the book.
Absolutely. There's nothing more true than fiction, right?
Yeah,
Sometimes.
exactly. I do feel that way. I think especially like emotional truth.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I would really like to know what your first climate fiction piece was and what your first written piece ever was, whether it was nonfiction, whether it was fiction. How did you get started as a writer, and how did you grow to become the incredible writer you are today?
All right, well, we're gonna go way back in the Wayback Machine. My mother ran a puppet theater when I was a child, and she wrote all of her own original scripts and performed these. So when other kids were like, skateboarding on Saturday, I was out being the assistant puppeteer at my mother's puppet theater. And when I was 10, I decided it was time I get into the family business. So I wrote my first script when I was 10 and it was performed, and I don't remember anything about it except that there was a wolf that had a stomach ache. That's the only thing I remember about the script, and I'm sure it was horrible. But then that kind of evolved. I got very into fan fiction before fan fiction was cool. I wrote in the 70s when I was like in elementary school. I used to write fiction scripts for Wonder Woman, Mork and Mindy, and Charlie's Angels TV shows, which is aging me a lot, I know. And then I would make my friends act them out. So we had I was always writing stories. I was always, even when I was in journalism and wasn't writing fiction, I had always been writing stories. The first piece of fiction, it wasn't climate fiction, but the first two pieces of fiction I ever had published, or I don't know if it still exists, but the Extension School used to have a literary journal called the Charles River Review. Does that still exist? I have a feeling it
No, I'll
probably
look that
doesn't.
up.
I think you would probably know about it, but there's a literary journal, and the first two short stories I ever had published were published at Harvard Extension School. Um, the first novel I ever wrote was Waiting for the Night Song, and that was the one that was accidentally climate fiction. Like I didn't know climate fiction was a thing. That was just the book I wrote. But after that book, everything I've ever written has been in the climate fiction, category. I think it's because I always talk about the two books I have published, the one that I'm finishing now, and I have a fourth book under contract, are all in different ways manifestations of very specific climate anxieties I have. And luckily for me, I'm super anxious when it comes to the climate, so I have lots of story ideas. So for me, it was never the decision to write climate fiction. These were just the stories I wanted to tell. And then somebody informed me that I wrote climate fiction. And but I did. My first thing was at Harvard Extension School.
That's amazing. I think that's how a lot of writers kind of other people tell us what we write rather
Yeah.
than, choosing like I'm going to be this kind of writer one
Yeah.
day. Um, how how does your writing process go? Are you a plotter? Are you a pantser? I know you've got all of that research that you've got in Scrivener. How do you then apply that to the page and then get the finished prose that we all see?
So, my first novel was very much a pantser novel. I just was winging it. I had no idea what was going to happen on the next page, and it was a big mess. I mean, I had that book was just like all over the place. These characters were just doing whatever they wanted, and then I started taking classes and started understanding, like, oh, there are rules to writing a novel, or like at least structure and general guidelines. So then I had to go back and kind of retrofit my book into that, and so that book, that's why it took 13 years to write that book, because I didn't know how to write a novel when I started. The second book and the third book are pretty tightly plotted from the beginning, and I am a plotter. I just didn't know that when I started the first book. So I plot my novels pretty good detail, and I allow myself to deviate from the plot whenever I need to. I do not feel like it's like a living document. Like the more as I go along, if things change, I allow myself to change, and then I kind of redo the plot. I mean the outline to fit what I've changed. But I also now this is gonna like some people are going to hate this idea, so I'm not suggesting everybody needs to do this. This is just what I do. But I visually plot all my books. So I get those giant pieces of poster board, the kind of used for, I can't see my arms. I'm making them very wide. But those big poster boards that you use for like science projects or, presentations. And I put an X and a Y axis on them. It usually takes two pieces lengthwise side by side. And I put most of my books tend to be somewhere between 35 and 45 chapters. And so I put all the chapters on the bottom axis, and then on the vertical axis, I put numbers 1 through 10, like and ranking the tension level of them. Each chapter is color coded by which point of view or which timeline it is, depending on the book. And what I do is I create a visual map of the tension in each chapter. And this really helps me because of writing multiple points of view and multiple timelines. I can see how the different timelines are interacting with each other. Like if I'm having a super high tension, situation going on in one point of view character, and then all of a sudden the next character, like the tension's a really quiet chapter, do they rub up against each other? Does it not, does the flow not work? And I'm sure you're probably familiar with the idea of a 3-act structure, with they showed that the kind of like an escalation and then the denouement after the climax. I do those with my books, kind of challenge myself to see how does it fit. I'm not a rigid believer in you must fit your book into a certain formula. There's a lot of people out there selling formulas. Like there's Save the Cat is a book that's on about it's actually, I think that's a really helpful tool when it helps you, as long as you have the confidence to deviate from it when you feel like you need to go off, on your own. But so I start with basic structure and I map it visually. On these charts, I map every character's arc in a different color, all on top of each other. So I have all these lines going all over, and it allows me to see how the different character arcs are interacting with each other. If one character is in a high stress situation and they're both having their crisis at the exact same moment, do I want to pace myself so that not everybody's having a crisis at the same time? Or is that a good thing? Is that make the story, that build the tension overall? So I always do these. So I have in my office, all over the walls, I have these charts, graphs, all sorts of visuals of my book, because it allows me to imagine visualize the suspense in my book. Like if it's flat for 3 chapters in a row, I'm like, we need to pick the pace up a little bit. Um, I think for a lot of writers, that would sounds like the worst thing in the world to graph your novel visually. So please do not take this as a directive that you must do this. It's just something that really helps me when I'm writing. And then when I'm revising a book, I will go back and redraw the graphs because they change. My characters, I move chapters around or I change someone's, storyline, and I go back and I redraw it. And it just helps me. I feel like I'm like seeing the book inside my head. Um, and I'll end up doing probably like 3 big graphs of the book by the time I'm done. And it's always kind of interesting to see how they look different, from the first graph to the end of the book.
It sounds like you're a lot more of a scientist than you're giving yourself credit for.
I don't know how scientific it is, but it works for me.
Yeah. So I want to go back a little bit. You said that your first novel took 13 years. So
Yeah.
fast forward now, and you've got 2 novels coming out 2 years apart from each other.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the pacing of writing and what your experience has been with the publishing industry and just kind of being contracted to write a book versus writing a book and figuring it out on your own?
Yeah. It's a big difference. So, um, when I sold my first book, when I sold Waiting for the Night Song, I had an agent and she'd been trying to sell it, and it took a year to sell. It was a really difficult year for me because I was getting a lot of rejections, and I was kind of on the verge of like, okay, this book is going in a drawer. During that year I was on submission, I started writing The Last Beekeeper, kind of as just a way to focus my energy to stop, like thinking about this book on submission and all these rejections I was getting. So by the time the editor who ended up buying my book made the offer, I had a rough draft of The Last Beekeeper in already done, which I got done in less than a year. So she bought it on proposal. Like she didn't read the rough draft, but I wrote up like a synopsis, like a 1 or 2 page synopsis of the book. And so she bought both books. And the second book, The Last Beekeeper, she hadn't read anything other than the synopsis. She was just trusting that she liked Waiting for the Night Song enough and trusting me to write The Last Beekeeper. So when I reworked that first draft and I got it in shape to turn it in, I turned it in and it was awful. It was really like rough draft doesn't even start to so it was a dual timeline and one of the timelines wasn't working. And so it wasn't harsh feedback, it was good feedback. So I went and we talked it through, and I had to basically throw 50,000 words into the garbage can and start the second timeline over from the beginning. The basic storyline of what happened didn't change, but how it happened and the setting where it happened changed. And a lot of the dynamics of the characters changed. So like my elevator pitch for the book was the same, the beginning and the end. But how I got there was very different. And it was a really difficult year for me. This was during the pandemic. My kids all came home from their various jobs and colleges during the pandemic. We're all in lockdown. My husband's working at home. And here I have this book that I thought was garbage. And that was a very, very difficult. And it took a little bit of time to process, to get back into the book and remember why I was writing this book. Like I love this book. Remember that? Like I love this book. And um and I ended up being really proud of it. I think it's better than the first book. And it took a long time to get there. So it ended up being delayed. Which I hate admitting that, but I talked to my editor. She called me and she's like, okay, so we could go forward with this book and hit your original deadline, and it'll be this kind of book. Or we can wait a year, wait a cycle, and you can revise the entire thing, and it'll be the kind of book I know you want it to be. And I'm going to let you choose. And I chose the year. So I got another year to work on the book, and I'm so grateful that she was willing to do that and to work with me. And I think that is the book that taught me how to write a novel. Because my first book was this 13-year experiment of like putting a little bit of this sauce in, a little bit of this in, and seeing what happens. And then having my agent work through it with me. I workshopped it. So I had a lot of hands on it. But when I turned in my second book, no one had ever seen it but my editor. And I learned a lot. So this time, my third book, I think I know what I'm doing now. Like I think it took 3 books to figure it out. So when I wrote my first draft, I looked at it through the prism of what are the mistakes I made with that second book? Like, am I making those same mistakes and trying to be very self-aware? Then I got 3 beta readers who I really trusted to read it and give me honest feedback, which they did. It was incredibly helpful. Then I gave it to my agent. My agent read it. She had some wonderful feedback. So by the time I gave it to my editor in November, it was in solid shape. And I knew when I turned it in, I was like, I think this is a good book. Like, I think it's like the shape of a book. It has a plot and suspense and, a satisfying ending. And, of course, there's things we're working on, and that revision is what's due next week. But I feel like I learned how to write a book by writing a messy, sloppy first book and then trying to cram in a short period of time a book that wasn't good, learning from that. And I do think I understand how to write a book now. It just took a lot of people and willing to invest their time um, and being willing to listen to their feedback and being willing to throw away 50,000 words. That's a really hard thing to do. But I'm very grateful, and I'm proud of all of the books. Like the way they ended up when they were published, I feel really proud of them. It just the journeys to get there weren't that easy.
Thank you for that very vulnerable look into what it's like to really write a novel. I
And I
think
should also say, though, that the writing of the third book has been my favorite writing time of my life. Like this third book that I'm writing right now, I feel so, I mean, I've loved writing all of them. Like even when I say there was, hard times, I love writing. I love it. But this third book has just been joy for me. Even the hard parts of the revision right now, I'm like in the trenches trying to figure out those last, getting those last things to fit together. I feel more joy in this process because I feel like I have better control of what I'm doing, and I feel more enthusiasm, um, just for myself when I'm reading. I'm like, oh, that's kind of a good chapter. I kind of like that. I just feel like I'm freer with my writing. I'm willing to take more risks than I used to be with, form and structure. And I think I see my own weaknesses a little bit more clearly than I used to.
absolutely. It's all about the process. It's all about trial and error. And I
Yeah.
like the cooking metaphor that you used, a
Yeah.
little bit of this, a little bit of that,
Yeah.
until you figure out what the best way is.
Yeah.
I would love to ask you this question that I like to ask all of our guests. What do you do when you have writer's block? Do you have other mediums that you like to express yourself in, and does that help the flow? I know that obviously having a farm, you might be a gardener, you might enjoy something like that. So what's your way of breaking that writer's block?
Yeah, I do love growing things and cooking a lot. So even though I sold the farm, I do have a pretty extensive garden, and it has a couple components to the garden. I have a big pollinator garden that's specifically planted with indigenous plants that support local pollinators, and I have a cocktail garden, which I grow herbs and a lot of fruit. Like I grow a lot of like blackberries, raspberries, blueberries. Peaches, all sorts of edibles and mint and a lot of herbs and a lot of edible flowers. And everything I grow in the cocktail garden are literally designed to be ingredients in cocktails. And so I grow a lot of like lavender and a lot of different herbs, and I'll infuse like vodkas for like weeks with like lavender and different herbal elements. And my husband's a great like mix master. So we'll spend like weeks preparing for when the elderberries are in season, and we'll make this specific cocktail out of this lavender infused vodka that I would um and then I also make tea, like herbal teas. I grow a lot of things for tea. So I grow my own tea, I dry them, I make my own tea blends, and I give them away as gifts to people. And I make blends that are like I have like an immunity booster tea. I have a stress busting sleepy time tea and a digestive tea. And so I do a lot of that in the summer. That I do a lot. I dry other herbs as well, just like kitchen herbs I grow and dry. And I also make paper. Um, I have a lot of little hobbies, little side gigs. This is also something, this is fun. Like if you want to do something really, really satisfying, you take your manuscript, not the whole thing, a few pages of your manuscript, and you shred it. You rip it up and you put it in the blender. and you put some water in there and you put some flower petals in there and you just blend it till it looks like a milkshake and you pour it through a screen and you press it and you dry it, and now you have revised your manuscript into stationery. And so I do this with my manuscripts when I'm done with each book, is I put them in a blender and I make stationery out of them, and they're beautiful. And so I use herbals from my garden. So I have a lot of nerdy crafts. I also dehydrate a lot of food that I grow, and uh, all sorts of weird. So I have a lot of nerdy outlets when I'm not writing, but they also work into my book. My third book, the one I'm working on, has an herbal storyline in it. And I also like, grow mushrooms, and so there's a storyline in the book about herbs, and they're from my garden. So I do have a lot of other little nerdy habits.
You're just inspiring me to start so many hobbies. I think I'm going to get a farm. I think I'm going to start a cocktail garden. That's
And if
amazing.
any of you do the stationery, I want to see pictures. I want to see that you can make envelopes, you can make just little note cards, you can make folded cards, and they're so pretty. You just put like flowers in, and the little pieces, the little flecks of the flowers will show up in the stationery. In fact, I have, if you go on my Instagram, I have a video of me making stationery out of one of my manuscripts. You'd have to go way back. It's from summer of 2022. I'm not very active on Instagram, so you wouldn't have to look that hard. But it's sometime, I believe, in probably in August of 2022, I believe. There's a video of me putting my book in a blender and making a stationery out of it. But I'd love to see it if anybody tries it. I would love to see it.
Yeah, if anybody tries it, definitely tag us and tag Julie because we want to see it. It sounds like the most cathartic thing ever.
It feels great. You have to do it with a manuscript that someone's written stuff on in red ink or something, like one of those that you just want to shred it, tear it up, and just throw it in the blender. It's incredibly satisfying.
Well, I think that might be the perfect note to end today on because it feels like such a perfect ending. So I know you've got those two projects that you're working on literally to the wire. Next week you're submitting. So you have those two novels coming out soon. So everybody be on the lookout for those. Is there anything else that you're focusing on right now that we should keep an eye out for? Are there any things? I posted a link to your website before, but I'll post it again now. Is there anything else that we should be doing to follow your journey? Because I think you're perhaps the most interesting person I've ever met.
Oh, maybe you should get out more. No, just kidding. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I'm not super active on social media. I know my agent and editor want me to be more, so I'm trying to be a little bit more out there. But I'm going to be starting a newsletter. That if you go on my website at juliecarrick.com, there is a link to sign up for my mailing list, and I'm going to be starting a newsletter. I'm not 100% positive this is the name of it, but I think I'm going to be calling it the second act Insomniac, because I tend to do a lot in the middle of the night, and I'm in my second act of writing. This is my second career, and so I am going to be writing a lot about the teas and the herbs and the cocktail garden and the mushrooms and how all of that is infused in my books. So if you want to, I haven't started. It's going to probably be starting this spring, but if you want to follow along there, that would be fun. I'll be writing about the writing process as well as my weird hobbies. And taking questions from people occasionally in the newsletter. I am on Instagram, and I think all the links are on my website. But I would love to hear from you. Follow me, and just say hi. And I would love to keep in touch with all of you. And I always like coming back and talking at this extension school, because I feel like when I was in the program, if someone told me I was going to publish a book, I wouldn't have believed them. Like, I would have been like, nah, yeah, maybe. And I did it, and I feel like it was a lot of work, and I think every single one of you can do it too. If that's where your path leads, or whether it's literary journals, or wherever the path is. I feel like I didn't believe it. I didn't have faith that it was going to happen back then, and I'm glad I stuck with it, and I hope you guys do too.
Thank you so much. That was extremely inspirational. We do have a couple of questions in the chat. Art would like to know what year you graduated the extension school. I'm curious too, because you said the classes were all in person.
Yeah.
Um,
It was one of the first years I think it was maybe the sixth year. So I was in 2005. And the only reason I know that specifically is because it was literally my son was born 2 days after I turned in my thesis. So I know exactly when it was. Yes, it's 2005. Um, yeah.
And then Nat wants to know, how do you write for longer than a few hours? Because she said she gets hand cramps.
I'm not one of those people that has like a strict writing schedule. Like there's some writers that they're up at 5 a.m. They light their candle and they have their herbal tea and they have I'm not like that. Some days I could write for an hour, and then there are absolutely days I'll write for 9 hours. That, it depends on where I am and then there's days I don't write at all. And there'll be like, I mean, I think I'm not supposed to say this out loud, but I'll go weeks without writing. Um, and I just sometimes I just can't write, and I wouldn't even call it writer's block. It's just like I'm not in a I don't know, I'm not in that space right now. Like I need to do something different. A lot of times when I complete a draft of a book, I feel really drained and can't write. So it for me, it's really in fits and spurts. And I allow myself to not write when I feel like I can't write. I don't, if I have a deadline, obviously, if you have a deadline, you need to write or ask for an extension or, deal with it in some way. But if I'm just drafting a book, and I feel like I can't write, I give myself permission to not write because I think in some ways we're always writing. I swim a lot. I do a lot of open water swimming in the summer and in the like now in a pool. And I feel like um, you know, that's like this meditative thing that sometimes I feel like I'm writing when I'm swimming. So if I didn't write today, but I swam, I I wrote, like when I'm gardening, sometimes in the summer, then when there's like high demand times in the garden. Um, I'm writing in my head or I'm thinking through a plot problem or a character or idea or something. So I don't know. I don't like to put too much pressure on myself to feel like I need to fit into like a certain number of hours or a certain number of words per day. I let myself go crazy and write like from sun up to sundown if that's what my brain wants to do. And I also allow myself to not write if I don't think I can.
I think not enough writers talk about that part of the process because you do have to balance having a life on top of the writing.
Yeah.
You have all of these other things that you're doing that are very important and that are nourishing to your body and your mind and your soul. You can't just ignore those because then the writing doesn't happen. So thank you for being honest about that and not, pretending you're a 5 a.m. candle
I'm
person who
not. And I think there's a lot of that on the internet. Of the 5 a.m. Writers Club is a hashtag. The people, all the people get up, and then I was just like, oh gosh, should I be doing that? Like, should I be getting up at 5 a.m. every day? And I can't, and I'm glad they can. I also wonder if they really do it every day. I don't know. I question that, but I think that we all need to just get comfortable with the way our brain wants to write, and to know that sometimes it's not going to happen the way we want it to.
yeah. Well, thank you for giving us those words of wisdom. I feel like there's been so much in this session that we've all learned. I feel like I need to go out and start gardening and farming and all of those different things. Do you have any advice on climate activism and how people can get started in that capacity? So, something to take away after this session.
Well, I love talking about bees because, having, kept bees and written about bees and researched bees. And I think that yeah, I do a lot of public speaking, and a lot of it is related to, climate activism and specifically on our pollinators. And I always say something really easy to do is whatever space you have, if you have an apartment or if you have a house or if you have no space at all, but there's a median strip across the street from you, wildflower seeds are great. Local planting local species because plants and animals evolve together in an ecosystem. And so the plants that are indigenous in your community evolved along with your pollinators. They need each other. Like the pollinators need this specific pollen from local plants, and the local plants rely on the pollinators. And so when you're planting, instead of just putting some, exotic, really cool thing, plant something local. And if you're feeling really motivated, what we did is we dug up part of the lawn, and that's where the pollinator garden is. It used to be grass, and grass doesn't really serve the environment very well, but I'm not a purist. I think a lot of people get hung up on like, but you still have a big lawn. You only dug up part of it. I'm like, yes, I do still have a lawn because I have other family members who like the lawn. And so we still have a lawn, but I also have a pollinator garden now that I didn't have before. And I think that being an activist doesn't mean you need to be a purist, and you don't like, like I'm skiing right now. I'm in Utah skiing right now. That is not the most environmentally sustainable sport, and I'm aware of that. I do other things. Like I feel like there's people out there on the internet that want to like cancel people all the time, that if you're not doing everything, you're doing nothing. And I do not believe that. I think activism can be really small. I think it can be planting 3 things in your yard and then maybe the next year planting more. I think, depending what your field is, day job wise, if you're in a dentist office, choosing products with, sustainable packaging, little things. I think that there's this like misbelief that to be an activist, you need to be, with a bullhorn standing up in front of people, or you need to be living in a yurt, collecting rainwater to drink on your roof. I think that there's a lot of space to be an activist and make a difference and share your ideas and not and like always try to do better. Like the things I don't do well, I try to do better. I try to improve. But I also am aware I am skiing right now, and I'm aware that that's not a great thing, and I'm going to allow myself to not be good at something. Like I'm not doing a great job today of being an environmentalist because I just rode a ski lift this morning, but I'm going to do other things that are good. And if you let yourself get into that mindset, I think it paralyzes people from doing things, because they think, oh, I'm not perfect, I'm not doing anything, or if I'm not representing good behavior 24 hours a day, I'm not an activist. And I don't believe that. And I think that there's a lot of failure and like online dialogues about that right now. That's something I talk about a lot, that I feel really passionate about. Whatever you're doing, try to do it a little bit better. Whatever you're doing bad, try to do it less worse, but you don't have to be perfect. And that's a start.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you for meeting with us today and taking time out of your day to talk to us. It's incredible to see that an HES alumni is as amazing and well hobbied and as wonderful of a writer as you are. So I really appreciate you coming out and speaking with us tonight. Thank you so much.
You're
Well, this is
next.
lots of fun.
What was that, Gustavo?
You're next.
Well, I look forward to seeing all of your books out there and, keeping updates. So, if you follow me on Instagram, say hi and maybe comment where we, remind me, because I don't have all of your names where we met, and I'll follow you back. And if you have questions or something, just, slide into my DMs or something. And if there's something we didn't talk about tonight, and if you have a question, and, let's stay in touch.
Thank you so much.
And we'll have a lovely evening. Thank you for inviting me to talk tonight.
You too. Thank you so much.
Okay.
All right, have a
Sure.
great night and break a leg in the next week.
Yes, just not
So,
skiing though. Just not
not
skiing.
skiing. Don't do that. Pizza,
Yeah.
French fry.
Yes, exactly. I'm gonna
Yep.
ski safely, and I'm gonna finish the book, and it'll all be great. All
Yes.
right, thank
All
you.
right.
Bye-bye.